Could I first of all say and emphasize very much the fact that I know almost nothing at all about developed countries, at least from a perspective of housing policy. My entire career has been built around the study of the developed world. And so I come to this meeting very much as an outsider. I was delighted to get the invitation because it gives me the opportunity to learn. And I suspect I shall learn much more from you than you'll learn from me, but we'll wait to judge that. The second thing by way of introduction is that I prepared my presentation and sent it through on, okay, thank you. I sent it through on Monday of this week. Before I'd had the opportunity to read Graham's paper. Having read Graham's paper and certainly listened to his excellent presentation this morning, I realised that many of the things which I was proposing in my presentation have already been answered. So I have a presentation which actually I don't particularly want to follow too closely now as a consequence of Graham's presentation, but nevertheless I will use aspects of it and add to it if I may. So let's try and, what am I doing wrong here? Something is not working. Which should I be presenting? Okay. Okay, that's it. Yeah, that's the next one, and we'll rapidly go through. So, as this indicates, my perspective on this is from the developed world, and really I'm trying to understand some of the things which I saw written in the context paper, and trying to interpret those from the world that I know about. I had wanted to start off with a rather general question of trying to understand how housing in the developing world, or how the approach to housing in the developing world fits with approaches to housing in the developed world. And I think it's quite important here to note that whilst it seems to be the phrase the Western world is used. Actually, there are many different Western worlds and very many different approaches. If we could turn to the next slide. Even you're having difficulties. Oh, good, excellent. Okay, so this is a starting point, which is a very simplified model of trying to understand how housing systems work and where housing policy can interject. Actually, it's in some senses a simplified, an even more simplified version than the one that Graham put up, but it's this notion that policy can intervene in a number of different parts in a chain. And I just wanted to note here that, of course, finance appears here as being important at each stage, potentially at each stage in this chain. But it's my view that in the developed world, when we think about housing finance, in many respects, housing finance doesn't really have very much to do with housing policy. Actually, what happens in housing finance in the developed world, it seems to me, is mainly driven by questions of macroeconomics and the ways in which governments want to develop or constrain the macroeconomy. It's also got an awful lot to do with politics and different groups in the population that governments might want to be nice to. So actually, looking at this from a developed world context, therefore, housing finance is not necessarily something particularly to do with housing. It has another world. But if we move on to the next slide. Oh. So this is, again, an attempt to be, which is very simplistic in a way, but an attempt to understand some of the variations in the developed world, in the way in which they organize their housing systems. And essentially this table groups countries according to the sort of the macro approach to politics and economics which prevails in that country. So it identifies communist countries, liberal or neoliberal market countries, social democratic, and also East Asian countries. And then looking at the three main stages, development, construction, and consumption, it asks the question, is the market or is the state, the government, dominant in organizing that particular aspect of what's going on? And you can see here that there are different models. So typically in a communist world, then all of these stages are dominated by the state. And in a liberal country like the United States, then the market will be dominant. And if we turn to the next slide, so I ask here on the bottom line, so how does the enabling agenda fit into this? And it seemed to me that if we're talking about enabling markets, then it would seem to be fit in with a model rather like the US model. And I had a number of questions around this, which I think actually have been largely answered by Graham's presentation. But I just wanted to offer one additional perspective on this, which occurred to me in the preparation. The phrase enabling markets, well, it seems to me enabling is a verb, but it's also an adjective. Enabling markets, I guess, is the way in which it was, as a verb, enabling as a verb was how it was intended. That was the message. The job of governments was to enable markets to operate within the housing sector. And so one can understand why, given that a piece of advice, governments might think that if they get out of the way, the crowding out thesis, if they get out of the way, then the private sector can come in and it can do the business. But of course, enabling is also an adjective. And actually what the discourse now seems to be about, and Graham's paper to an extent was about, was markets that enable, or markets that are inclusive. So really, the phrase ought to be enabling markets, not enabling markets, but enabling markets, or enabling to the power of two markets, if you wanted a neater way of putting it. Okay, so if we move to the next slide. In the next few slides, I took a number of sentences from the concept note and was attempting to understand these from a developed world context. Actually, there's not very much I want to say about this particular slide now, given what Graham's had to say, but pick up on one thing which he talked about, which was the property ladder, which of course relates very much to this. Being on a property ladder, from my perspective as a Westerner, doesn't mean that as you move up market, that you don't have anything to leave your children. In fact, the more you move up market, the more you have to leave to your children. So that these ideas are not inconsistent. But also from a developed world context, this whole notion anyway is changing quite rapidly as a consequence of demographic change. In much of the developed world, fertility rates are plummeting downwards. The average woman in the advanced East Asian economies is having one child, which means actually that a lot of women are having no children at all, and that therefore the notion of building up assets in order to create an inheritance begins to become less and less meaningful in any way. And so I suppose one question from that is already, of course, the developing world is going through the same demographic transition. At what state does that demography also change to alter this? If we can have the next slide. This again is picking up something which was in the context note, but also that Graham raised, which was the question of subsidies should be demand-side subsidies rather than supply-side subsidies. This, of course, has also been a feature of housing provision in the developed world, where there has been a general tendency to move from supply-side to demand-side subsidies. One of the things in many of the developed countries which restrained the introduction of demand-side subsidies was that they tend to require a lot of information and a lot of monitoring. Actually, it's very easy, in some senses, it's administratively very easy to deal with supply-side subsidies because you're dealing with often a single builder or a single developer. You can pass over a lot of money. Whereas as soon as you turn to demand-side subsidies, you're dealing with lots of individuals, so you have many more assessments to make. But you also need to recognize that the circumstances of individuals will be is often very volatile, so that they move, some people move in and out of poverty or in and out of low income, and therefore there may be frequent changes needed in their circumstances and need for subsidy. And so I suppose my question here is whether the sort of knowledge infrastructure, the bureaucratic infrastructure exists within the developing world in order to create this sort of policy, this sort of subsidy arrangement. Because if it doesn't, then there's something which needs to happen before the subsidy structure can change. And that something means the acquiring of lots of information and the acquiring of a bureaucratic administrative system which will allow that to happen. And my final slide, my final slide is about rental markets, and specifically it related to a specific statement in the concept note. Rentals will find their own level of sufficient housing is available. I don't know who wrote this, but of course rentals will find their own level if insufficient housing is available as well. But the question that I wanted to pose here, but is that a fair or an efficient level? And the experience from the developed world anyway is that actually there are grounds for thinking that it won't, and that maybe some sort of constraints are needed on landlord behaviour in order to ensure that rents are also fair to tenants. But this raises for me a bigger question. I took from Graham's presentation that a notion that the rental sector was something which ought to be encouraged. That governments were not doing that, and therefore what we needed to do was to organise housing finance, and out of that would come a reinvigorated, bigger rental sector. I somewhat paraphrased, Graham, forgive me. But it seems to me that this is a view which says that the single or the only problem is the lack of finance, and it may be that finance is a problem, but I suspect that there are many other barriers also to the development of of a vibrant operating rental sector. And there would be a danger, I think, in simply saying what we need is more finance, because it might simply recreate the sorts of difficulties and limitations which are currently experienced with the promotion of home ownership. That, in a sense, it moves the problem, but it doesn't get rid of it. And I wonder to what extent it will be necessary to try to create a policy framework which is somewhat similar to the policy frameworks within developed countries. That means finding ways of encouraging supply to come into the sector, which might, how do you do that in a developed world context? And you meet the same sort of administrative and knowledge problems as you have with demand-side subsidies. Do you try to use tax subsidies, for example? Well, you need to know what people's income is. They need to be working within the formal sector in order for that to happen. How do you protect tenants in that world? And so, for me, this is. I know this meeting is about housing finance, but there is something much broader than housing finance and the context in which it must persist.